This is a magnet. A small one, the kind you'd find holding a photograph to your refrigerator. It weighs about 6 grams, costs maybe 30 cents at a hardware store. Completely unremarkable until you understand what's inside it. This magnet contains neodymium, a rare earth element so powerful that a piece the size of a quarter can lift 1,000 times its own weight. Without neodymium, the motor in an electric vehicle doesn't function. The guidance system in a cruise missile doesn't stabilize. The turbine in a wind farm doesn't spin. The hard drive in every data center on the planet doesn't store a single byte. 6 grams, 30 cents. And as of January 21st, 2026, you cannot buy it. Not at any price, not through any channel. Not if you're a Fortune 500 company with billion-dollar supply contracts. Not if you're the United States Department of Defense with procurement authority that theoretically supersedes market constraints. The rare earth supply chain didn't slow down. It didn't experience disruption. It stopped. Completely. For Western buyers, the flow of 17 critical elements, neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, praseodymium, and 13 others, has been reduced to zero. China just weaponized the elements that make modern technology possible, and there is no countermove available. Here's what they're not telling you. At 6 a.m. Beijing time on January 21st, the Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China published document 2026-7, titled Interim Measures for Export Control of Strategic Mineral Resources. The document is 14 pages long. It has been translated by fewer than 200 people in the Western world, and it fundamentally restructures who is permitted to purchase refined rare earth elements from Chinese suppliers. The key passage appears on page 9. Effective immediately, export licenses for Category A strategic minerals shall require end-use certification, national security review, and ministerial approval for all transactions involving entities domiciled in nations participating in semiconductor export restrictions targeting the People's Republic of China. The language is bureaucratic. The implications are absolute. Category A strategic minerals include all 17 rare earth elements, plus gallium, germanium, antimony, and tungsten. Nations participating in semiconductor export restrictions include the United States, Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea, Taiwan, and, as of October 2025, the entire European Union. China has not banned rare earth exports. Technically, the trade remains legal, but the licensing requirements are designed to be impossible to satisfy. End-use certification requires disclosure of the final product, its components, its intended customer, and its ultimate application. For defense contractors, this means revealing classified weapon systems to Chinese ministry officials. For technology companies, it means exposing proprietary manufacturing processes to state-controlled review. No Western company can comply. That's the point. The mechanism exploits a vulnerability that has been visible for 3 decades but never addressed. China controls 60% of global rare earth mining. That figure sounds concerning but not catastrophic. Surely 40% from other sources provides alternatives. But mining is not the choke point. Processing is. Rare earth ores extracted from the ground are useless in their raw form. They must be separated, refined, and processed into oxides, metals, and alloys before they can enter any supply chain. This processing requires specialized facilities, proprietary chemical techniques, and decades of accumulated expertise. China controls 92% of global rare earth processing capacity. The 40% of ore mined outside China, in Australia, the United States, Myanmar, and elsewhere, flows to Chinese processing facilities before it becomes usable material. The rare earth mine in Mountain Pass, California, ships its output to China for refinement. The Australian operations at Mount Weld send their concentrate to Malaysian facilities that are joint ventures with Chinese state enterprises. There is no alternative processing infrastructure. Not because it's impossible to build, because no one built it. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. For 25 years, Western governments and corporations operated on an assumption so fundamental it was never questioned. Global supply chains would remain open. Trade relationships might experience friction, but no nation would actually sever the flow of critical materials. The economic interdependence that made globalization profitable also made it stable. Everyone had too much to lose. The assumption was wrong. China's rare earth dominance was not an accident of geology. It was a strategic investment spanning 4 decades. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping famously observed that the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. The statement was not descriptive, it was prescriptive. It announced an intention to create leverage equivalent to OPEC's petroleum dominance, but over materials even more essential to advanced technology. The West heard the statement, Western analysts wrote papers about it. Western policymakers acknowledged the risk in classified briefings. And then Western corporations continued offshoring rare earth processing to China because it was 40% cheaper than domestic alternatives. The savings have been calculated at approximately $12 billion over the past 2 decades. The cost of the current supply disruption, according to preliminary Defense Department estimates leaked to the Financial Times, exceeds $340 billion in the first year alone. The paper versus physical distinction has never been starker. American and European companies hold contracts with Chinese rare earth suppliers worth $47 billion in future deliveries. Those contracts specify quantities, prices, delivery dates, and quality standards. They represent legal obligations enforceable in international trade tribunals. But contracts are paper. Neodymium is physical. And when physical supply ceases to flow, paper claims become worthless. Lockheed Martin holds procurement agreements for 340 metric tons of rare earth materials annually, enough to produce F-35 fighters, missile systems, and advanced radar installations. As of January 21st, those agreements represent claims on material that cannot be delivered. The contracts remain valid. The lawsuits will take years. The production lines stop in weeks. Tesla's battery and motor manufacturing requires 12,000 tons of rare earth inputs annually. Their supply contracts extend through 2031. The contracts are worth approximately $2.1 billion. The contracts are also, as of 9 days ago, impossible to fulfill. The gap between paper commitments and physical reality is the gap between what was promised and what exists. $47 billion in contracts, 0 kilograms in deliveries. When institutions do what they're doing now, they're not managing risk. They're discovering they have no tools to manage it. On January 22nd, less than 24 hours after document 2026-7 was published, the White House convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council's Supply Chain Working Group. The meeting lasted 11 hours. No press statement was issued afterward. On January 23rd, the Defense Production Act was invoked for rare earth materials, the first time this Korean War-era authority has been applied to mineral resources. The invocation allows the federal government to direct private companies to prioritize defense contracts and to provide financing for domestic production capacity. But the Defense Production Act cannot create processing facilities that don't exist. It cannot train chemical engineers in separation techniques that take years to master. It cannot accelerate geological timelines or conjure supply from empty warehouses. The Pentagon's Strategic Rare Earth Reserve, maintained precisely for scenarios like this, contains approximately 18 months of defense-critical supply at peacetime consumption rates. But consumption rates in a supply crisis are not peacetime rates. When manufacturers realize allocations are finite, they overorder. When overordering depletes reserves faster, panic accelerates. The 18-month buffer becomes 11 months, then 7. Then the arithmetic becomes classified. Less than 72 hours after the Chinese announcement, Japan activated its own strategic reserve protocols. South Korea followed within 24 hours. Taiwan, which produces 92% of the world's advanced semiconductors, each requiring rare earth inputs, declared a materials security emergency on January 25th. The scramble for existing inventory is already underway. Spot prices for neodymium oxide have increased 470% since January 21st. Dysprosium, essential for high-temperature magnet applications in aerospace, is up 680%. For terbium, used in advanced display technologies and precision-guided munitions, there is no functioning spot market. The last recorded transaction was January 23rd at $8,400 per kilogram, up from $1,200 per kilogram the week before. Since then, no seller has offered material at any price. The market has not experienced a price spike. The market has ceased to function. While one side scrambles, the other side consolidates. The timing of document 2026-7 was not arbitrary. It arrived precisely 6 weeks after the United States, Netherlands, and Japan implemented their most restrictive semiconductor export controls yet, the so-called December package, that prohibited Chinese access to extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, advanced chip designs, and semiconductor manufacturing software. The Western position was clear. China would be denied the tools to manufacture cutting-edge processors. This would slow Chinese advancement in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and military technology by an estimated 5 to 7 years. The restrictions were celebrated as a strategic victory, a demonstration that democracies could coordinate economic pressure on an authoritarian rival. The Chinese response was equally clear. If China cannot buy advanced semiconductors, no one can buy rare earth materials. The escalation ladder has no intermediate rungs. Semiconductors are essential. Rare earths are essential. Each side has targeted the other's critical dependency. And unlike semiconductors, where South Korea, Taiwan, and eventually the United States offer alternative supply, rare earth processing has no non-Chinese alternative at meaningful scale. China did not choose this battleground by accident. They chose it because they win on this battleground. The People's Bank of China has simultaneously announced a rare earth strategic reserve expansion program. Over the next 36 months, Chinese state enterprises will acquire an additional 180,000 tons of processed rare earth materials, roughly equal to 3 years of current global production, for domestic stockpiling. This material will be purchased from domestic producers at guaranteed prices, removing any incentive to serve export markets, even if licensing restrictions were lifted. The supply that previously flowed outward will now flow inward. Chinese manufacturers of electric vehicles, wind turbines, consumer electronics, and military systems will have access to unlimited rare earth inputs. Their Western competitors will have access to none. The geopolitical reconfiguration extends beyond bilateral US-China tensions. Russia, which holds an estimated 10% of global rare earth reserves, announced on January 24th that it would expedite development of processing facilities through a joint venture with Chinese technology partners. The facility, located in Siberia, will process ore from Russian and Central Asian sources using Chinese separation techniques. Output is scheduled to begin in 2029. All production is pre-committed to BRICS nation purchasers. Western companies need not apply. India's rare earth reserves, substantial but undeveloped, have suddenly attracted attention from both sides. On January 26th, the U.S. Trade Representative flew to New Delhi for unscheduled consultations. The Chinese Minister of Commerce arrived the following day. India, which has carefully maintained strategic ambiguity between Western and Eastern blocs, now finds itself holding cards it never expected to play. The resource that was economically uninteresting at $40 per kilogram is strategically essential at $400 per kilogram. Geography is reasserting itself over spreadsheets. This is what a system looks like when it discovers its own fragility. The Western industrial base was designed for efficiency, not resilience. Every redundancy was eliminated. Every buffer stock was minimized. Every just-in-time delivery system assumed that time would always cooperate. The assumption was encoded into quarterly earnings reports and celebrated by management consultants. Lower inventory costs, higher capital efficiency, shareholder value optimized. But efficiency and resilience are opposing forces. A system with no redundancy operates perfectly until it doesn't operate at all. A supply chain with no buffer stock flows smoothly until it stops flowing entirely. The rare earth disruption reveals what was always true. The Western industrial economy is a precisely calibrated machine with no tolerance for deviation. Remove any single input, and the entire apparatus seizes. Electric vehicle production lines are already announcing slowdowns. General Motors suspended 2 shifts at its Ultium battery facility in Ohio, citing critical material sourcing delays. Volkswagen's Salzgitter plant has reduced output by 35%. Tesla's Berlin Gigafactory is operating on existing magnet inventory with no resupply date confirmed. Wind turbine manufacturers face the same arithmetic. A single 3-megawatt offshore turbine requires approximately 600 kilograms of rare earth permanent magnets. European orders for offshore wind installations totaling 14 gigawatts in 2026 now have no pathway to completion. Defense implications compound the civilian disruption. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter requires 920 pounds of rare earth materials per airframe. The Virginia-class submarine program uses rare earth magnets in propulsion systems, sonar arrays, and weapons guidance. The Patriot missile system, Javelin anti-tank weapons, and Predator drones all contain components that cannot be manufactured without Chinese-controlled inputs. The arsenal of democracy depends on supply chains controlled by its principal strategic adversary. This was known. This was documented. This was never fixed. The trap has no visible exit. Developing alternative rare earth processing capacity requires 5 to 7 years under optimal conditions: political will, unlimited funding, expedited permitting, and no technical setbacks. Realistic timelines extend to 2032 or beyond. Stockpiles provide months of buffer, not years. Recycling programs that recover rare earths from discarded electronics yield volumes measured in hundreds of tons against demand measured in hundreds of thousands of tons. Substitution research, developing technologies that don't require rare earth inputs, has progressed for 2 decades without producing commercially viable alternatives for high-performance applications. There is no motor design that matches neodymium magnet efficiency. There is no metallurgical process that replicates dysprosium's heat resistance properties. The physics cannot be negotiated with. Some analysts suggest diplomatic resolution, that economic pressure on China from supply disruption will force Beijing to restore exports. This analysis misunderstands the strategic calculation. China has spent 40 years building rare earth dominance. They endured losses, subsidized production below market rates, and absorbed environmental damage that Western nations refused to tolerate domestically. The investment was not commercial, it was strategic. And strategic investments are not abandoned when they finally generate returns. Document 2026-7 is not a bargaining position. It is the exercise of leverage that was always intended to be exercised. The only question was when. Other analysts propose that China's own economic interests will force compromise, that Chinese manufacturers need Western markets for their rare earth-dependent products. But this analysis inverts the dependency structure. Chinese electric vehicles can be sold domestically and throughout the global south. Chinese wind turbines are already being installed from Pakistan to Brazil. Chinese consumer electronics dominate markets that have no alternative suppliers. The customers who need China outnumber the customers China needs. The leverage runs one direction. It always did. The question is not whether industrial reorientation will occur. That is now inevitable. The question is who understands the timeline and acts accordingly. Manufacturers with rare earth inventory are not selling it. They are hoarding it, converting balance sheet assets into physical stockpiles, extending production runways by months rather than surrendering strategic positioning. The companies that understood supply chain risk 5 years ago are now discovering that their paranoia was insufficient preparation. Investors are recalculating valuations for every company with rare earth dependency. The market capitalization of Western EV manufacturers has declined by $340 billion since January 21st. Defense contractors are down 12%, despite being obvious beneficiaries of increased military spending. The math is straightforward. You cannot benefit from defense contracts you cannot fulfill. Meanwhile, capital is flowing toward the few non-Chinese rare earth assets that exist. MP Materials, the operator of Mountain Pass, America's only active rare earth mine, has seen its stock price increase 280% in 9 days. Lynas Rare Earths, the Australian producer with Malaysian processing capacity, is up 340%. Neither company can meaningfully increase output for years. The price movements reflect desperation for any asset with physical rare earth exposure. Physical beats paper. Atoms beat promises. Possession beats claims. The framework that applies to precious metals applies equally to industrial minerals that were never supposed to become scarce. The reality asserting itself is simply this. Control of essential materials confers power that cannot be negotiated, arbitrated, or sanctioned away. For 70 years, the United States maintained global hegemony partly through control of the dollar, partly through military superiority, and partly through an assumption that resource dependencies would always be manageable through market mechanisms. The assumption has been disproven. The market mechanism required willing sellers. Willing sellers required shared interest in commerce over strategy. That shared interest no longer exists with China, may never have existed, and certainly does not exist now. What replaces the old framework is not yet visible. Perhaps domestic rare earth processing emerges over the next decade. Expensive, environmentally contentious, but strategically necessary. Perhaps alternative technologies reduce rare earth dependency, slowly, partially, insufficiently. Perhaps geopolitical accommodation creates new trade arrangements, though accommodation from a position of weakness rarely produces favorable terms. What is visible today is simpler. The supply chain that sustained Western industrial dominance has been severed. The severing was deliberate, strategic, and, for the moment, irreversible. The magnet on your refrigerator still works. The neodymium inside it still holds. But the next magnet, the one for the next electric vehicle, the next wind turbine, the next missile guidance system, comes from a supply chain that no longer includes you. That reality cannot be spun, managed, or denied into remission. It can only be understood. And understanding, at this point, is the only advantage still available. The factories are already calculating how many weeks of inventory remain. The generals are already revising procurement timelines. The engineers are already searching for substitutes that don't exist. And somewhere in Beijing, the Ministry of Commerce is preparing document 2026-8. Because when leverage finally works, you don't use it once. You use it until it stops working.